So as we left it last time, I said that, where do we go from here? What is the alternative? How do we resolve these problems? And so I'll be talking about viewpoint number 4, which is Tawheed al-Ahadi. And I translate that into English with the word non-duality. Okay, it's translated as oneness. Okay, but that's Tawheed al-Adadi, it's oneness. Ahadiyya is talking about non-duality, where there is no second. It's like saying one, but it's focusing on the fact that there is no second, non-dual. Okay, la thaniya lahu. So that's the view I'm going to go into. In the literature, this is called the school of Irfan. Okay, this is the Irfani school, and this viewpoint is something I've spent about 25 years studying. This is the view that I hold, but everyone should evaluate for themselves and see what they think. Okay, so with that, let me go into the some of the slides and explain what we mean by this ahadiyya. Okay, so this is where we left last time. All right, so viewpoint number 4, the Tawheed al-Adadi, understands God as being non-dual, infinite, self-aware being. Okay, so it's a very long description, but it's infinite, self-aware being. That's what God is understood as being. Okay, and what does this mean? It focuses on this name al-Ahad, which does not mean one, means non-dual, which means it has no second. Non-dual means that there is not even the possibility of a second entity. Okay, not even the possibility. It's not just that there is only one, but there could be more than one. No, there is one, but there is not even the possibility of a second thing altogether at all. Why is that? How is that possible? Well, it's by understanding that God's being is infinite. You see, if something is infinite, then there is no room. There's no possibility of something else. You see? If God's being is limited, like we had in the traditional view, then the possibility of something else can be there. His being ends at some point, and then the being of something else, his creation or anything else, can be there, even if it's not actually, that there's more than one God. It can be there. But if it's infinite, the possibility is not even there. So it's a higher level of understanding of Tawheed, because it eliminates even the possibility of second. It's a more intense, deeper level of Tawheed. Okay? So under this understanding, God is not a being that has limited limits of any kind. He is being itself. He is infinite being itself. Allah huwa al-wujud. Huwa laysa mawjudun. Huwa al-wujud. Okay, he is being itself, and that being is infinite. Okay, and this is actually very close to the concept of the wajib al-wujud that we talked about. Okay, because think about what we said before, and then when we went into this viewpoint number 1, number 2, number 3, we actually deviated away from the concept of wajib al-wujud. This is just a reminder that what you see here on the slide down here is just a repeat of what I had before. Okay, we said that wajib al-wujud, بالذات, its essence is being, right? Unlike any mumkin, it is wujud. Its essence is wujud, and it has no mahiyya. It has no limits. It has no constraints. It has no definition. None of those things, right? So it is pure being, wujud baht. It is basit. It is sirf, absolute. No limits exist, because limits create dependency. They create imkan. So I'm not actually saying anything new here. Only thing is, we're committed to it. We're not forgetting this. When you go to the traditional view or the viewpoint number 2 or number 1, you see that this is kind of forgotten. We introduced, whether it was by accident or intentionally, we introduced limits, right? And we said that wajib al-wujud should not have any limits. So this viewpoint of non-duality focuses on this and stays true to this. God's being has no limits. Now, the issue is that when you do that, the question becomes, but if God's being is infinite, there is only his being, then how do we make room for the being of the world, of us, right? Where do we fit if there's no second, if there's no way for God's being to end somewhere and then someone else's being to start? Then where do we fit? I mean, we exist, right? We have existence. The world exists. So how does this work, right? How can we understand these things together? So that's what we're going to go into now, to understand a perspective that stays true to this infinite being with no limits, but finds an interesting way to understand how the being of the world fits with that. How do we reconcile these two things together? Okay, so that's what we're going into. And the basic idea is that God is infinite being. His creation, everything in the world, is a manifestation of God. Okay, it's an appearance of being. All right, it doesn't have real existence like God's existence. It is real, but not like his being. It is a manifestation. So we'll go into this now. It begins by thinking of God's essence alone first, before creation, before anything else. We call it al-haq, God's essence itself, absolute being with no limits. The name that is usually used to refer to this level of being is al-haq, okay, and has no limits, as we said. Now, the interesting thing is that when you say that it's pure infinite being, then it is actually totally unknowable, because there's no way to discern anything about it. There's nothing we can say about it. There's no limits, there's no form, there's nothing about it. So the way that it's understood in Irfan is that it is unmanifest, okay? It exists, of course, but it's unmanifest. It is batin. Cannot see anything. You cannot differentiate. You can't make out anything about it. It is batin, totally unknowable. Okay, so that's the starting point. Then, if we ask, so what is the world? What are we? The answer is, the world is a manifestation of that absolute being through different forms. And the word manifestation here, they use different words to explain it. One word is tajalli. Okay, tajalli. This means manifestation. And that comes from the Quran, you know, the ayat where Allah says, فَلَمَّا تَجَلَّى رَبُّهُ لِلْجَبَلِ. Tajalla, he manifests himself. That's the word they use. It is a manifestation of that unknowable batin. It becomes zahir through these tajalliyat. Okay, and that's the other verse to use to understand all of this is هو الأول والآخر والظاهر والباطن. Okay, so we started with al-batin, the unmanifest, and then we recognize that he is also a zahir, so he appears. He is a zahir, he is the manifest. And so that's what this world is. The world is a whole infinite set of forms, different mahiyat, right? Different forms that are possible ways in which being can appear. Okay? That's what everything is. So if I take this ball, for example, right? This is an existing form, right? It is wujud in a particular form. It is a possible way for wujud to exist, to appear. It can appear in this form, or it can appear in any other form. Now, the way that these forms come into being is quite interesting, okay? The forms actually exist always, eternally, in God's knowledge, in that batin form, in an unmanifest form. They are always there. Because God, as pure infinite being, is fully self-aware, right? I said he's self-aware being, is aware of all the potential, all the possibilities of being. And all of that exists in his knowledge from the beginning, eternally, okay? And what happens is that those eternally existing forms in his knowledge are made manifest, okay? They exist in a batin form, and then they become zahir. And this ayah is very interesting if you think about it. When he says, إِنَّمَا أَمْرُهُ إِذَا أَرَادَ شَيْئًا, if he wants something to happen, يَقُولُ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونُ, right? This is something we all know, kun fayakun. And usually the focus is on the word kun, right? Be, and then it is. But actually, when you want to understand this process of how it happens, the most interesting word is actually lahu. Okay. The most interesting word is lahu, because he says yaqulu lahu kun fayakun. Okay. He says to it, be, and then it becomes, which means that something already existed in some way. And then he says to it, kun. You see? Yaqulu lahu. Lahu is already there. It already exists in some way. And he says to it, kun fayakun. So it's not nothingness. You see my point before? Where the traditional view is that everything is created out of pure adam, pure non-being, nothingness. That's not the case, because at the minimum, everything existed in God's knowledge, as knowledge, okay? So that's what it's referring to. يَقُولُ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونُ. It was a form, a particular possibility of a being, existed in God's knowledge, and is then made manifest. And that's what dhuhur means here. So the act of creation, creating, means that they become zahir. Okay, and then when they go out of existence, they are not becoming nothingness. No, they go back to being purely only in God's knowledge. They become batin again. So they go from zahir to, they go from batin to zahir and back to batin again. Okay, and so in Arabic we can say, in summary, من الظهور إلى البطون وليس من الوجود إلى العدم. There's no such thing as adam, okay? Because God's being is there always as a substratum. There is no room for any kind of adam. His existence extends through everything, all time. So there's no room for any kind of pure non-existence. There's only butun and dhuhur. And so the whole understanding of how God creates everything is very different. You know, normally we think it's almost like magic. There's a Adam and poof, he turns it into a wujud. Right? That's kind of the image we have. It's just popping into existence. This is different. This is saying that it had a kind of existence always in God's being, and it just becomes manifest and then goes back to being unmanifest. Okay? Yet always existing, but just in different forms, so either unmanifest or manifest, zahir and batin. Okay, so this hopefully gives you an overall picture how this vision is understood. But I'm going to use an analogy, an example, to help to try to visualize how this works. No analogy is perfect, but I find this one to be quite interesting and a good way to try to understand it, okay? And it starts, I want you to imagine a screen, okay? An infinite screen, all right? So take, the screen of your mobile phone, but imagine that this screen is actually infinite, limitless, okay? It fills all of space, just the screen. And the screen is self-aware, okay? And the screen can have images appear on it, or it can have no images, just like any screen that you have. Now, I'm going to look at the relationship between the screen and the images that appear on the screen, okay? What I'm going to say is going to be very obvious, but I want you to think about this, and then we'll apply it to this understanding of the relationship between God and his creation, okay? All right, so this table will take us through the summary, right? So we're going to look at the properties of the screen, and then we're going to look at the properties of the images, all right? The screen exists before the images, okay, and independent of the images. Now, what does that mean? It means that at the beginning, there's only a screen. There don't have to be images, right? The screen could even be off. There will be no images on the screen. And the screen in that way is independent of the images. Whether it wants to have images or not have images, it's up to the screen, right? So it's independent of the images. Its existence does not depend on the images. But the images is the opposite. The images depend entirely on the screen to exist. No screen, there would be no images, right? But they also have a derivative existence compared to the screen, right? The screen exists, but the images can come and go, and they depend on the existence of the screen. So their existence is dependent. It is derivative. It derives from the existence of the screen, okay? Now, what else? The screen is not limited by any image, right? So you can see in this example on the slide, you have different icons, right, of these different apps. And in the background, you've got this picture of stars and stuff. These are limited images, individual limited images. But any image that arises on the screen does not limit the screen in any way whatsoever, right? Very obvious. The images themselves are limited, but the screen does not become limited by anything that appears on it, okay? Next, the screen is unaffected by any image, right? No matter what you watch on the screen, you could watch a movie with fires and explosions, nothing affects the screen, right? The screen is unaffected by any image. But the images are entirely affected by the screen, right? The screen is off, the images disappear. Also notice that the images are not separate from the screen. They don't exist separate from the screen, okay? Next, the screen doesn't become the image, right? It doesn't transform into the image, right? The image disappears. It just appears on the screen. The images don't become the screen, right? The images, do these images turn into a screen? No, they're just pictures. They're just images that appear on the screen. Do the images merge with the screen? Or do they unite with the screen? No, that would be a silly way to describe it. They just appear on the screen. They don't turn into the screen. The screen doesn't turn into them at all. And finally, very obvious statement, but I'm going to repeat it more than one time because we will use this going forward. The screen is not the images, and the images are not the screen. Okay, they're different from each other, but they're not separate from each other. And I can summarize that in what you see down here. There is differentiation, right? There is a difference. Screen is one thing. The images are something else. There is differentiation, but there's no division between them. There's no separation between them. You see? They are not existing separate from each other. And so this becomes a beautiful way to try to understand this relationship between God and his being. God being like the screen, infinite, unaffected by anything, eternal, untouched by anything that appears on the screen. The images entirely dependent on God, entirely all of the forms that appear in the universe, entirely dependent on that which allows them to appear. But they don't touch it, they don't affect it, they don't limit the screen in any way. They are not separate from it. They don't become it. They don't merge with it. They don't unite with it. They're not it, but they're also not separate from it. Okay, so that's how the analogy works. And then the extension of this is what I sent earlier today. Inshallah, you had the chance to take a look at the couple of videos that I sent about holograms. In case you think, you know, this example that you gave, Hani, is very interesting, but you know, it's a two-dimensional screen. It's just a bunch of colors on the screen. That this whole world is three-dimensional, and it has colors, and it has sounds, and it has smells, and it has touch, and it has all of these things, right? Can everyone go on mute, please? Thank you. In case you think that, what you should have seen in the hologram videos is that holograms, you know, the screens that we've had in our lives so far are very simple screens, you know. It's just a two-dimensional screen with visual output. We also have sound, but even that comes from speakers. It doesn't come from the actual screen itself, right? And that's all we've kind of been used to. But you can already start to see from this new technology that you can have very sophisticated screens that are three-dimensional, that you can touch them, you can hear them, right? The images that arise, they can be three-dimensional, you can touch the image. It's almost like a real thing. You can even hear it, you can feel it. And so you can imagine more sophisticated screens, right, that allow for this multi-dimensions of different types of senses. And so we can extend this analogy, this example of the screen, and that becomes what this world is. It's like a three-dimensional world where it's like a three-dimensional screen where all these different ways of experiencing are enabled by that infinite wujud that's there. Okay, so that's why I sent that video, is to give you an idea that yes, you know, in the example that I gave and I went through detail, it's a simple case of a two-dimensional screen. That's what we're used to, but hopefully you can see that that doesn't prevent this example from being extended to cover all of the dimensions that we are used to in our existence in this world. Okay, so that's why I love this way of visualizing it. No example is perfect, but it helps to understand what is this relationship. When we say dhuhur, yeah, tajalli, that these mawjudat, these things that exist, this world, are different manifestations, madahir, or tajalliyat, they are appearances. This is how you can understand it. And then you say, but how can you say that God has, you know, appeared in these forms or is like a screen? Well, think about that relationship. This understanding of God preserves everything that we need to preserve about our understanding of God. And I'll show you one by one what I mean by that. So this non-dual understanding, what does it actually kind of achieve? What is it what is it able to do to overcome the problems that we saw with the other viewpoints? Okay, so let's go through some of them. First of all, it avoids limiting God's being in any way whatsoever, right? We said, imagine that this screen that we're talking about, right, this infinite being is unlimited. The screen itself is infinite, okay? Now, when we have images appearing, do they limit his being in any way? Again, I repeat, no image limits the screen at all. So we preserve this unlimited, infinite being through this perspective. We avoid this numerical understanding. God is not just one screen or one being or something like that. He's infinite. And so we overcome this issue of Tawheed al-Adadi. Then we also overcome this issue about Adam and Wujud, the turning non-existence into existence, right? We said that that doesn't make any sense. Again, it will implicitly create limits for God because God becomes next to Adam and turns Adam into Wujud. All of that is avoided. All of that is avoided because creation, right? Al-khalq, the process of khalq, is the process of dhuhur. It's not the process of something coming out of Adam into Wujud. Okay, so we avoid that through this perspective. We avoid making God similar to his creation. Okay, laysa kamithlihi shay. Well, in this example that I gave, there is only one infinite screen. Okay, there are no other screens, and nothing that appears on the screen can be like that screen in any way whatsoever, right? Do any of the images become anything like the screen? Right? Think about that. Any image that arises on the screen, does it become like the screen? Does it have any of the characteristics of the screen? Absolutely not. The screen is something totally different. Its being is totally different in nature compared to the existence of and the properties of the images that arise. All right. Next, we avoid, God being inside or outside because he's infinite, as we said before last week, that we avoid all of this issue of, inside or outside his creation. It pervades everything. There's nowhere where God isn't. There's nowhere that his being ends. And that's it. There's nothing beyond that. It also then avoids creating this izla, this separation between God and screen. As we said, in that example, that the images are not separate from the screen. They don't have a separate, independent existence to him, right? So we've managed to get this intimate relationship without any kind of separation, but also without any kind of mixing or something entering something else. As I said before, the images don't enter the screen, or the screen doesn't enter the images. They don't merge in some way. They don't unite in any way. None of that applies. But at the same time, they are not separate from him. Okay. We avoid God being affected by his creation. As we said, no matter what happens, no matter what appears, it doesn't affect the screen on which it's appearing. So God is totally unaffected by his creation. When we say tanzih, we want to, make God, transcendent, beyond his creation. This is how we do it, not by creating a separation between them, but by creating a perspective, having an understanding where all of this creation can appear, and yet it doesn't affect him, even though there's no separation between them. Okay, it's a very interesting way. Now, note some of these points here. Okay, again, I want to repeat, because a lot of people, when I've heard, people misunderstand this viewpoint very easily. It's a very delicate, sophisticated, very subtle, it's very latif, very subtle way of understanding God and his nature and the relationship with him. And I find that people misunderstand it and mischaracterize it very easily. They say, "Oh, you're saying that God is this world is God." Absolutely not saying that. Just remember, the appearances are not identical to the essence, right? So there is a Dhat, the Dhat Allah, which is unknowable, unmanifest altogether. And then there's the appearances, the activity or the manifestation of it. They are not the same thing. The thing in itself and its appearances are two different things. They're not identical to each other. Just like the images are not identical to the screen, okay? They are only now this is another Qur'ani word, shu'un al-haq, okay? The activity of God, okay? The manifestations of God, tajalliyat, the appearances, madahir al-haq, okay? Just as the images are only the activity of the screen, you see? The images are what you see on the screen. It's like an activity appearing on the screen. It's not the screen itself, okay? And as I said, this word, shu'un, comes from this ayah in the Quran, kullu yawman huwa fi sha'n. All the time, he is in some kind of an activity, some kind of a manifestation. And that's what this world is. It is his act, his activity, his manifestation. It's not him, but it's also not separate from him. Okay, so it may be a little bit tricky to understand these things, right? At the same time, it is not him, but it's also not separate from him. It is his activity, his manifestation. And these verses, again, just different ways of saying the same thing. Shu'un, tajalliyat, madahir. These are the ways to understand what this world is and every single thing that's in it. Okay. Now, how did we achieve all of this? If you look at this, what does the non-dual understanding achieve? We achieved all these things, but how is it doing it? What is it what understanding is different from the traditional view? And I can summarize it in one thing, and it is this: appearance. Okay, and I've used different words for it, right? Tajalli, madahir, right? Appearance of something does not require real separation. It does not create real limits or boundaries, and it does not affect that which is being manifested. Okay, I'll repeat that. This is the difference. If you understand the world exists in real form, it really, really exists. Its reality is the same as God's reality, then you are creating real separation. But here we're saying, no. These makhluqat, these things of the world that you see, don't have that level of reality to them. They have a lower level of reality. They are just appearances. Something can appear and it looks like there's a boundary. It looks like there's separation, but it's not real. It's not really real. That's how you avoid this clash of God being infinite, but insisting on separation. So appearance has that ability to do it, right? You can appear to be separate. You can appear to have limits. You can appear to have boundaries, but they're not real. There's a difference between what's real and what appears, okay? And so you can summarize all of this by saying, God alone is real, and the world is simply an appearance. That's it in a nutshell, to understand this whole perspective and how it is able to kind of tick all these boxes, right? Of avoiding any kind of limits, avoiding, making God similar or being affected by his creation, having a body or not having a body and being separate or not. All of these things are solved by having this understanding of infinite being and manifestations of being. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. What I'll do now is just kind of clarify a couple of things. One is that one of the reasons why I started with pantheism is because a lot of people misunderstand this view and they kind of equate it with pantheism. They say, oh, but you're saying, you know, this is God's being. Oh, you're saying that the world is God. You're saying that I'm God, you are God. That's not what we're saying. This is not the same as pantheism. So I want to clarify that. Remember what we said. Pantheism said God is the world and there's nothing else. So everything is God. That's what pantheism said, right? And one way of understanding pantheism is that it only acknowledges the manifestations. It's not recognizing that there's an underlying essence that gives rise to the manifestations. Pantheism is not recognizing that. Whereas in non-duality, we are recognizing that there is an essence that is always there and it's unmanifest. It's independent of any of the manifestations, okay, that thought, and then the manifestations are something else. Pantheism doesn't see that, okay? So pantheism thinks that God is the universe and claims that God is in everything and identical to everything, that there is nothing else, right? In contrast to that, non-duality is saying that there is a single underlying unmanifest reality, okay? Dhat al-wujud, that's one thing. And then that single reality appears in the form of the world. But in its essence, it remains unchanged, independent, but not separate from the world. Again, we avoid that separation. Okay? Non-duality clearly differentiates between the essence, which is unmanifest, and the manifestations. Okay? These are two separate things. And these are not recognized in pantheism, but they are in non-duality. So it's much more sophisticated than the pantheistic view, right? And so we claim that the manifestations of being are not identical to the essence, right? The manifestations and the essence are not identical. The screen is not the images. The images are not the screen. The universe is not God, but it's also not separate from God. It is a manifestation, as simple as that. So I want to differentiate because you will hear a lot of people talk about this view as though there's no difference between non-duality and pantheism. So that's why I'm making a point of highlighting this. And I will end by just sharing what I personally have seen as advantages of this view and why I've spent most of my life going deeper and deeper into it. It is very deep, very sophisticated, and has some unique advantages. And I just wanted to share some of those with you guys. One is that, as I said, it goes beyond a simplistic understanding of God. So remember when we had pantheism, it was pure immanence. God is the world and that's it. And then we had the traditional view, which was complete transcendence, right? God is separate from the world. He's beyond this world. This view combines the two together. You see, God pervades the world. The being of this world is God's being. But at the same time, the essence is not the same as the manifestation. So it combines transcendence and immanence. Okay? By defining God as being itself, the interesting thing I have found is that I can have a discussion with even non-religious people. Because if you explain to them, listen, God isn't some magical, supernatural being. No, he is existence itself. You'll find that it's a much more fruitful discussion with them. I can honestly tell you, I've had discussions with atheists and I say, oh, that's fine with me. Existence exists. Yes, I accept that. Now, they might not agree with other aspects of things, but it's a much more easy discussion to have rather than, oh, there's this special being separate from this world, created this world out of nothing. Those things you will create a lot of clash with people. I have found personally that this approach leads to a much deeper level of certainty, a kind of yaqeen that goes beyond the traditional view. It's just my personal experience, okay? And the reason is this: when you make God completely separate, and you just insist, oh, laysa kamithlihi shay, completely, there's no connection, between, he becomes very abstract, almost distant. Now, at the same time, they say, no, he's close to you, he's told you he's close, but it just creates a kind of abstractness to God, right? God is completely beyond this world. And so this view brings God even closer, because his being is directly manifesting itself in everything that you experience around you, including yourself. Everything, its being, anything you look at, the being of that thing is God's being, because there is only God's being. The form of that being, the limitations of it, the characteristics of it, that's not God. That's the mahiyya. But the wujud of everything is his wujud. There is only his wujud. That's what we've been saying. So now look at the world with very different eyes. What you're seeing is his being with limitations in different forms. The limitations and the forms are not him, right? We said the manifestations are not him, but the existence of those, the underlying being of everything, is his being. This is going to bring a much more intimate level of relationship with him, right? It's not just that this world and everything in it are the creation of God. No, you are able to actually experience his being directly. Okay. That's how intimate the relationship can become, and the certainty that comes with that, because there is no doubt that you can experience being every moment that you're awake. That's it. You experience being, that means God is here. So that's the level of yaqeen and intimacy that is possible with this view. And what you find is that this school, this approach, this perspective then goes much further in terms of practical techniques of inner spiritual work to internalize this understanding. Because what I've just described to you is now a conceptual understanding. And probably I've bombarded you and you'll need a lot more time to absorb it if you're not familiar with all of this. But there's much further to go, because there are spiritual practices that we learn to now internalize this, make this something you actually experience directly, not just understand, not just accept. And this school goes much further than any other in developing that experiential dimension. Okay. And then final point. I have found this to be unique and very comforting. And that is that this understanding of God is actually a universal one. What I have found from my research is that if you look at all of the major spiritual traditions in the world, all of them, from Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, all of them, they all have one school, like the Irfani school, which sees God in this way, exactly in this way, understands God not as a particular type of being or a trinity like in Christianity. No, they see God as being infinite being. Then there's differences in terms of understanding how the manifestations work and so on. Yes, but the underlying understanding is identical. And I've studied this across these different religions, and I've seen it for myself. It is a very profound agreement across all of these. So the traditional schools in each of these religions totally disagree with each other, right? The Christians with their Trinity, the Hindus with thousands of gods, the Muslims with one God, and all of the clashes and total disagreements. That's the traditional schools in each of these religions. But actually, there is a school in each of these religions which has this understanding of God, and when they sit together, they totally agree on everything. It's quite unique. And to give you an example of what I'm saying, as I said, in Islam, it's called the Irfan. In Judaism, they call it Kabbalah. In Christianity, it's called Gnosticism. In Hinduism, it's called Advaita Vedanta. In Buddhism, it's Mahayana, etc., etc. So there are schools in each of these that hold this understanding of God. And I think that's beautiful, because if there is something we can call, that we can call a universal truth, right? It should be something that is found to be true by people anywhere, at any time in history. They should arrive at the same conclusion. The fact that there's so many clashes and different views, for me, was always something unsatisfying. And so when I found this universality of this perspective, this feels to me, it's not a proof that it's correct, but it does resonate for me personally, that I can see harmony across different schools from completely different backgrounds throughout history have arrived at the same conclusion about the nature of God and the nature of reality. And for me, that's very comforting and indicative that this is a beautiful way to understand things. So I'm going to finish by saying once more, this is just my personal views. I've spent a lot of time just today covering all of this because this is my specialty. This is what I've spent most of my time on. Everyone needs to evaluate it based on their own views and see what makes sense to them. But I caution that, again, everyone needs to make sure they understand it correctly and not bring accusations from different schools across from each other. You should really learn about these things from the school itself. All right, I'll stop there, everyone. Thank you.